All right, hello and welcome. Please use the chat function while we are getting started to introduce yourself. We would love to know your role out there, where you are located. I bet most of you are here in Washington State. It'd be interesting to see if anyone isn't, but let us know where you're at, what you're doing. We are so happy that you're here. I am Lindsay Stevens. I am the Executive Director at the Center for Strengthening the Teaching Profession. And I am just so very excited to be welcoming you here today. This conversation has been something I've actually been trying to make happen for quite some time. And so I just can't believe that it's happening. So in listening to these two amazing educators, Dr. Stembridge and Dr. Novak, through the past 2 years, I've just been struck by the alignment of the frameworks for both culturally responsive education and universal design for learning, and how they're really changing the way that teachers and educators are showing up for students and families and making our schools fundamentally more equitable and inclusive. So I just cannot wait to kind of thread these things together. I want to start with a huge thank you to OSPI, to Brooke Brown for being here to moderate, to all of you for taking the time to be here to listen and learn, and most of all to Dr. Stembridge and Dr. Novak for allowing us to witness this conversation and to continue to learn from both of them. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. We will be having a question and answer session after the initial conversation, so please use the Q&A function to pose questions. We will be working hard to collect those and get them to Brooke in order to answer as many as we have time for near the end of the session. Next week, you'll be receiving an email from Erin Marzowick. Erin, you want to give a little wave? There's my wonderful Erin. She is our amazing events coordinator here at CSTEP, and it will include a follow-up survey as well as a link to the recording for today's conversation. I did want to let you know that if you stay for the whole 2 hours, you can also apply for 2 clock hours through CSTEP for a small fee, and that information will be included in the follow-up email as well. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our partners at OSPI in the Educator Effectiveness Office.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sue Anderson from the Educator Effectiveness Office at OSPI, and I'm really excited that you're here with us today to learn from Drs. Novak and Stembridge about supporting educators in operationalizing equity. This is something we've been looking forward to for a long time, and just really excited that you're joining us today.
I'm Katie Taylor. I'm an Associate Director in the Educator Effectiveness Office. Also excited, I have a feeling that many of you are going to look back on this day as the spark that ignited some transformational practices. So really excited to be listening and learning with you.
All right, and now I'd love to get some welcome from our other partners in the OSPI Special Education Department and Inclusionary Practices Project.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks everyone for joining us today and for allowing us to be a partner in this work. Just couldn't be more excited about today's conversations. My name is Tanya May, and I am the Executive Director of Special Education here at OSPI, transitioning into the role of Assistant Superintendent. And it has been truly the honor of my professional life to be a part of the Inclusionary Practices Project. And when I think about the priorities that have come out of that work, it truly aligns with the discussion we're going to engage in today, which is partnering for equity, shaping inclusionary practices and outcomes, leading with intention, and fostering excellence. And so I'm just so honored to turn this over to today's amazing moderator, Washington's 2021 Teacher of the Year, Brooke Brown. Welcome, Brooke.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever everyone is zooming in from. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to host this super exciting conversation. I have been working in the Franklin Pierce School District for the past, this is my 16th year, and transitioned out of the classroom to now serve as an instructional equity specialist. So in our district, in the Franklin Pierce School District, we're working with Dr. Stembridge and with Dr. Novak, both with culture responsive education and universal design for learning. So I couldn't be more excited to be a part of this conversation today with these two rock stars. So I just want to say thank you. I look forward to the conversation, and Lindsay already explained how to put the questions in. We will have question and answer time at 12:30. So I would love to, I'm not sure, Lindsay, am I passing it to Dr. Novak or are you? Sorry.
Yeah, just go right on ahead.
All right, so Dr. Novak is here on my screen, so I would love to introduce Dr. Novak. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. So I am super excited to lean into this conversation and introduce the framework of universal design for learning. And I love teaching with analogies. So we're going to start off by talking about what is not universally designed. It's starting to get nice. We're transitioning into spring and summer, and pretty soon we're all going to be like, whew, it is really hot. And I have some Common Core standards for summer fun, which include cooling off and getting refreshed on a really sweltering day. And as a party planner, I have this incredible privilege to design something that may or may not include all of you and make you feel like you belong. So let's talk about traditional party planning. If I was going to do it based on my interests and my own identity, and I'm even going to really try to make this work for everyone. So everyone knows technology makes things more accessible. So I'm going to invite you all on TikTok, which, you know, I'm sure you're all going to love to see that. And then I want to make sure to eliminate barriers. So I'm going to get all of us the same swimsuit, gender neutral, one size fits all. Clearly it's going to work for everyone. And then I'm going to know that you cool off because you're going to play water volleyball in the deep end. And then you're going to obviously get refreshed with a Mai Tai. So what I know for sure with this kind of silly example is that there's going to be some people who that will work for. But many people are excluded from cooling off and getting refreshed simply because of the design. Because I haven't designed it so everyone can learn about the party. I don't have material so everyone feels like they belong. And there's so many triggers here. The trigger with, you know, body image and alcohol. And what I'm doing here is by design, I'm creating these triggers for trauma. I am not being culturally responsive. I'm designing what might work for me for a party, but that's not what we're trying to do here, is how do we design a learning environment that truly works for everyone so every person can work toward the same firm goals. So when I'm talking about universal design as a framework, I'm going to talk a lot about these three core components. The first is that recognizing variability means that even though we work toward the same goals, we need very different tools and very different strategies and very different environments to get there. And there's both interpersonal variability, that we're different from each other, and intrapersonal variability, that my needs change from day to day, from emotion to emotion. And therefore, I should have the power and the privilege to make decisions about what is best for me every day. And so we believe in variability, we believe in firm goals, and we believe ultimately that every student should be given an opportunity to become a learner, to be able to reflect and be more self-aware, to make choices, to try to figure out what works best, and to really embrace the fact that that involves a lot of really beautiful trial and error. And when a lot of people learn about universal design for learning, they think of it as simply a skill set. But I want to pose to you another analogy, that the work that we do as practitioners is really standing on three legs. The first is our belief system. Do we believe unequivocally that all students are capable of greatness? Do we believe that it's our responsibility as educators to get the environment right for every kid? Do we believe in the assets and the cultural capital that students bring to us? So UDL is not just a skill set. It's about what we believe about what is possible. We have to build a skill set that allows us to eliminate barriers, which requires that we're trauma informed, that we understand what it means to be linguistically appropriate, and that we're culturally responsive. Because a lack of those things creates considerable barriers that exclude students from the opportunities that are rightfully theirs, high expectations, and the feeling that they belong, that they get to be exactly who they are, and they'll be successful in our system. And lastly, the system has to do a lot more work to support this. We need really flexible, culturally responsive curriculum. We need time for professional learning. We need to connect with families and our communities. And so when you think of UDL, don't just put it in the box of a lesson planning template, but how do we recognize the barriers systemically, pedagogically, and within our own beliefs that prevent all kids from doing as well as they deserve? And now I am going to pass it over to you, Dr. Stembridge.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon for everyone tuning in. I'm super excited to be here. I don't start my timer yet, Brooke, because I got to just send some shout outs. Thank you to my partners, our partners at OSPI. Thank you to C-STEP. I feel like Jeannie, Aaron, Stephanie, Lindsay, and then Zara. Appreciate you all. Special shout out to all the teachers here. Teachers are my personal superheroes. So if I have anything to say, hopefully that's useful. I'm speaking to teachers. All right, so I just wanted to say that. And Brooke, shout out to Brooke, 2021 Teacher of the Year. So much respect and appreciation for you. I love the time that we had over at Washington High School. I never got an update on Casey's learning experience. So I really want to hear about how that learning experience went for Casey. All right, so I just want to give a couple of brief short words on what it is I mean by culturally responsive education. I'm already hearing tons of overlap with what you're saying, Katie, and super interested and excited to jump into this conversation. When I talk about culturally responsive education, I'm building on ideas that come from, I think, 4 primary thinkers: Gloria Ladson-Billings, Lisa Delpit, University of Washington's own Geneva Gay, and Sonia Nieto. They're the 4 scholars and thinkers who I think of as kind of most responsible for laying the groundwork for this idea of what I mean by culturally responsive education. When I think of culturally responsive education, it starts with cultural competence. Hopefully we're going to have a chance to talk more about this here today. When I'm talking about culture, I'm thinking less about the specific features of a social group, and I'm asking a more kind of broad question, which is, what does culture do? And so what role does culture serve in the human experience? If we can really deepen our understanding of what culture does, then we are more likely to be able to leverage culture in the interest of rigorous and engaging and inclusive, meaningful learning experiences for kids. Beyond the cultural competence, there are culturally responsive habits, ways of thinking. And so when I'm thinking about culturally responsive ways of thinking, I'm thinking about these intellectual patterns of thought that then show up in the practices that we choose to bring to our students. So I'm thinking about things like, this is not intended to be an all-inclusive list, a comprehensive list, but viewing teaching and learning as a journey and not a destination. Regularly thinking about my thinking, listening and observing with understanding and empathy, questioning and innovative problem posing, designing learning experiences with a focus on engagement. Many of you know that I think of engagement as the money boat, and mining actionable data from students' learning experiences. So these are just the partial list of what I might think of when I think of culturally responsive habits of thinking. And then beyond that, the rest are, as Gloria Ladson-Billings said in one of the really important articles that define this work, the rest are just good practices. And so it's not just good practices, but the rest are just good practices after we've anchored ourselves in a deep knowing of what culture is, and then develop those mental habits to be able to inspire the selection of practices that work for kids. So that's my 30,000 foot view definition of CRE. And again, just really excited to be here and a part of this conversation. So yeah, Brooke, let's get it on.
Thank you both so much for sharing just really the foundation of both of your work. And yes, Yemi, I will make sure that I get you and Casey connected. So thank you again. So My first question, and we sort of just, Yemi sort of touched on it a little bit, but I would love to hear, after you've had the opportunity to listen to one another, what are the major alignments or intersections of your work that are standing out to you after you've heard the other person sort of share their quick overview?
Sure.
You wanna go first, Katie?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
One of the things that struck me was just the depth of each of these frameworks, that I think they often get compartmentalized as like, this year, we're gonna do UDL and CRT, as though it's a skill set that you build in a 2-hour presentation, and not how you commit your entire career, your design work, your belief system to eliminate barriers and celebrate all learners for who they are.
Yeah, I'm also struck by UDL's emphasis on empowering students, really centering students, giving them the agency to be able to direct their own learning, their own discovery, which is, I think very consistent with a lot of the things that I'm talking about, that people are talking about when they talk about culturally responsive education. I think that all responsive education should have the ultimate goal of empowering learners to feel like the effort that I'm being asked to give is worthwhile. And so, I literally don't blame a human being, particularly a student in a public school, for being disengaged when they feel disempowered in the learning environment. I think it's weird to try hard in an environment where I don't feel like I am seen and valued, and I have an opportunity to really, leverage what is unique and interesting about me. So I think that idea of empowerment is a really important idea that I think lives in both frameworks, and something that we should be really emphasizing throughout.
Thank you so much. So I really hear student empowerment, and part of that process of student empowerment is really for educators to really get to know who's in their room, to really understand the students that they serve. And so another question that I have is, how do we help educators have a shift in their belief system and focus? How do we support educators in that really important work?
So one of the first steps for me is, a lot of people will come up to me and they'll be like, where do we start? And I think that, I think Mark in the chat has already touched on this, is that a lot of the exclusionary practices that are, in classrooms, that are a part of, kind of baked into our systems, are the same that we often experience in professional learning. And, what's so interesting is, during the pandemic, people talked about there was this like real concern with student engagement. But as a teacher of adults, and within myself, speaking for myself, it was very, very difficult in that learning environment sometimes to commit. And so I think that modeling those practices can be absolutely huge. So simply by asking colleagues, we have these firm goals for our improvement, but like, what do you already know about this? And what are some ways you'd like to learn? And what materials do you need? And how would you like to show me what you've learned? And just as we can have a classroom that supports multiple tasks and formats, so too can we have a faculty meeting or a professional learning session that we're saying what do you need for this to be meaningful? And let's provide that. And, Chris Emden, I love his work on reality pedagogy. And he says, for him, bottom line is, equity is hearing someone's voice about what they really need and kind of getting out of the way and providing them with that. And I think that as adults, sometimes we need to experience education that is truly inclusive, where barriers are removed. So we have this kind of vision of what we can create for our learners.
Yeah, that's deep. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I do a lot of my work in residencies where I'm elbow to elbow with teachers, and we're talking in very real terms about the challenges of classroom practice. In my residencies, I try to invite inelegant questions, because I think that in order for me to support a teacher, and that's my goal, right? Teachers are my personal superheroes. So my task is to support teachers, and my task in supporting teachers, I try to regularly remind myself that it's more important for me to be effective in supporting teachers than it is for me to be right. And that means that sometimes I have to engage with teachers in ways that I would have some resistance to. Here's where I'm getting to. Sometimes the ways that I have to help a teacher to shift their beliefs is I have to get them to see that a more responsive mind frame, right, a more responsive outlook for their practice is going to make their life easier. And, you know, some people I think they feel overwhelmed with a kind of initiative fatigue. And we were alluding to this earlier, right? I had a principal once who said to me that their teachers feel like they have, you know, just one more thing on the plate. Now, of all the things we have to do now, we also have to do equity. Now we also have to do CRE and you know, and what she was saying, we were speaking specifically in terms of equity. She was saying that she wanted them to understand that this is not one more thing on the plate. This is the plate. And so for me, you know, when I go into classrooms on many occasions, especially when I have a reluctant learner in the form of a teacher, right? Because my students are teachers, I start to think about what would make this teacher's life easier. And, you know, I'll tell any teachers watching this right now, if you require this kind of positioning for you to shift your beliefs, you know, you're probably not going to get into heaven with that attitude. But for me at this point, what I'm most interested in is trying to be effective in creating the spaces that are best, you know, most beneficial for our students to learn. I could say more about that, but I'll leave it there for now.
One of the things that you said that struck me so much is this, like, CRT and UDL, like, they're not nouns. Like, it's like, how do we universally designed? How do we respond in ways that, like, really elevates and celebrates, like, the full cultural experience, and not like it's something you put on a shelf? And so I always say when people are like, oh, we're doing UDL, I'm like, well, that's not a noun. So how are you eliminating barriers? How are you elevating student voices? Like, that's the work. And it's clear that that work is ongoing. And as you said, that work is the plate.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Yemi, you always got the one-liners that keep me cracking up. I appreciate you and your candor. One thing that I had the privilege of participating in a fellowship with Yemi, and actually in the book study with CSTEP last year, which shout out to CSTEP and their book studies. You should hop on that opportunity. But one of the things that really struck me that I think connects to this is when you talk about culture responsive practices, or really the focus of culture responsive education for educators is not to be an expert on every student's culture in your classroom. It's really becoming an expert on how to provide opportunities for students to leverage their culture in the learning opportunities. And so I would love to sort of think about how that connects to shifting our belief focuses. Can you speak on that a little bit as we start to think about sort of shifting that mindset? Because I think that is one part of culture responsive practices that seems really overwhelming. That feels like, well, how do I have time to know the background of every single one of my students? And so I would love for, and Dr. Novak too, if you want to chime in as well, I'd love to hear.
You know, I'm super interested in culture, and I just finished this morning reading a book. I'm not recommending this book. It's called Culture and the Evolutionary Process. I'm not recommending this book. This is Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson. These are the two people who kind of came up with this theory of dual inheritance. Yeah, right. So like I've been in some classrooms in the state of Washington. My first district that I worked at in Washington was in Vancouver. And one of my favorite schools in the state of Washington, I always like to shout them out, Fort Vancouver High School. I love those teachers over there and the kids over there. You go into a Fort Vancouver high school classroom, and there may be, you know, 30 kids and 20 different racial and ethnic and language backgrounds represented in the room. And so I think that it is unwise and generally unproductive to think that culturally responsive teaching requires this expertise, as you call it, in the different, you know, habits and customs and traditions, you know, kind of those symbols of culture that that are represented in the room. I think that it's problematic to think that way because ultimately I find that leads to just a nicer form of stereotyping. And when you develop what you think is this expertise on a cultural background, and then you have a kid who maybe, colors outside of the cultural lines, then you start looking at that kid as like a broken member of a social group. And that's whack. That's a terrible way to think about, teaching and who your kids are. And so, so when I'm thinking about culture, right, in my book, I talk about the iceberg metaphor, thinking about kind of the part of culture that's above the waterline, and then the functional part of culture below that guides our behaviors and also kind of our visceral reactions to different experiences. In the book that I'm working on now, I'm really thinking about culture. I want teachers to think about culture as kind of the instincts that we have for making inferences. And so again, right, culture at the deepest level are these rules that we abide by to properly human. See what I did there? I made human into a verb, right? And so your norms, the goals that you have around humaning, the expectations that you have for how others human is really a function of your culture, the lens that you use to make sense of the world. And so what I'm asking people to do in culturally responsive teaching is, can you design learning experiences that leverage every single one of your students' capacities to draw from their backgrounds, to draw from their cultural fluencies, to draw from their funds of knowledge in order to show competence in the learning environment? And so that's way deeper than food, fashion, and festivities. That's something that's really giving every one of your students the opportunity to fully express their humanity in the interest of a rich learning experience. Doesn't usually happen with worksheets, though. It's hard to do that with worksheets. So that's part of the challenge in terms of how we have to set this up for our kids.
Yeah, I mean, the connections that I always make too is I think that when we try to get to know our learners, which is critically important. This work is built upon relationships. So we do absolutely have to connect with our learners and families and communities, but that when we feel like we have figured someone out, that's not recognizing what intrapersonal variability is all about. That like, even when you can get to know someone really well, we're always changing. And this goes back to this transcendentalist poem. Ralph Waldo Emerson, way back, said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." And I love that quote. The foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of little minds, meaning that like we grow and we evolve. And just because you know my interests today doesn't mean that they're my interests tomorrow. And that's why this co-creation of a learning environment is so incredibly important, because it's, the concept of like, I know you and I can design for you makes this assumption that you're static. And none of us are static. And so, when people say to me, they'll say to me all the time, what does this look like for? Like, fill in the group. Right? So talk to me about what UDL looks like for, students who are learning English as an additional language. And I'm like, I literally can't answer that, because if you think about the beautiful diversity of a group of kids who are learning English as an additional language, we're talking about different identities, different levels, different language proficiency, different like backgrounds in school. There's so many differences. So people will say, okay, I get it. So what does it look like for like students who are at like a level 1? I'm like, again, that group of students is incredibly diverse. You could even go as specific as, what does it look like for Katie? Like, is Katie hungry? Is Katie tired? What type of day is Katie having? And I think that for too long, the system made us believe that we could figure out exactly what our kids needed if we tried hard enough. And we're burying ourselves in that effort, as opposed to saying, this is the goal, and let's talk about all the different ways that we could reach this goal. And I will check in with you and we'll look at evidence of the impact of your choices on your learning, because ultimately this is about learning and success. But again, it transcends, I am going to give you something, to like, we are going to create something together. And that is a huge mindset shift. And there's very few people that learned how to teach that way, which is why there's this cognitive dissonance around the work.
I want to just say something more about that. So I love how you're framing that, Katie, right? This, we are creating together, which again comes back for me to this idea of empowerment, and also this idea of community. And, I think that I know I wasn't taught to teach like this. I mean, I was barely taught how to lesson plan. So the idea of co-creating a community of empowered learners, I think a big part of the shift in our teacher thinking is we have to decenter ourselves. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, like, what's it going to look like and feel like if I completely lose control in the best possible way of this learning experience? And I should be hoping to lose control in the sense that my students are making their connections and building their bridges in a way that I couldn't anticipate, precisely because these are not static human beings. And that's, you know, if a learning experience, if school doesn't give me a chance to continue to evolve, to stretch out, if the expectation of being successful in school is that I have to stay static, stay the same, well, again, right? Like, I mean, who would want to go to school for that? So yeah, just a lot of connections there, Katie, that I'm making as you're talking.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love how every conversation that we have, Yemi, we never get away from a book recommendation or non-recommendation. I so appreciate that. And people say the same thing about me. Yeah.
I have more. I'm holding back.
We'll have to connect later because I don't need to order any more books. That is a hobby I picked up during the pandemic. I order everything. Yeah, anyways. So I so appreciate your last comment, Dr. Stembridge, because that's exactly what I was going to come back to, is sort of thinking about, we've talked about empowering, we've talked about sort of how do we help educators shift, we've talked about how we need to work together with students, but what sort of pre-work do we need to be able to do? Because it's difficult to model things for our students that we haven't first done the work to do. What would you say are sort of the pre-steps that we need to work on as educators, understanding our positionality in the classroom before we're ready to really be able to co-construct sort of learning goals and culture responsive practices?
I know one of the first things for me is always, this is about ensuring equitable opportunities to learn rigorous grade level instruction. And so I think that because, UDL is all about, recognizing what are the firm goals, I do think that there is some work that precedes being able to universally design something effectively, which is what really is it that all students have to know and do. And we need to get out of kind of the space of, thinking about the different, themes or topics that we teach, and like, what does the actual standard say that all students really honestly need? And is this knowledge of which they can just express their knowledge in multiple ways through, reenactments, through, poetry, through video, right? Or is this a skill? And I think that sometimes if we don't really know our goals, we tend to decrease rigor. So as an example, I was an English teacher, and as an English teacher, students have to learn how to write. So one of the goals is that students, learn how to write in ways that are either, persuasive or informative or narrative, for example. And we certainly know that there's significant barriers to saying to students, okay, everyone read the hard copy of this text and then everyone write a response, right? We can predict that some students might not have, the language capacity to do that yet without scaffolds and supports. We know that some students might struggle with organization, so a lot of people go, oh, I universally designed it, I just let them tell me. No, like, students have to be able to produce writing. So when we start with the firm goal of students will write, and I say to students, okay, let's look at some examples and non-examples. Let's talk about the importance of being able to share your work in writing. Then I start thinking about what's the best way for you to share your work in writing. Do you want to write it first in your first language so we can celebrate translanguaging? Do you want to use voice to text to produce it? Do you need graphic organizers? Do you need peer reviews? Let's talk about the strategies and the tools that will be helpful so all of you feel like I can figure out my way to get really great writing on paper, so then we can work together and make it even better, right? And I think that sometimes in the name of UDL, we make allowances and lower expectations, and then we end up with this negotiated curriculum or this watered down curriculum. And both of these frameworks, from my understanding, are about kids are capable of rigorous work. if we recognize the very oppressive and exclusionary ways that we have designed it is simply a way and is not the way.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so Brooke, right, I'm thinking about a couple of things. I'm thinking, in terms of that work that we have to do. So I'm right on the same page here with Katie. We need to know what it is we want our students to understand, which is something that is deeper than just a content standard. It includes a content standard, but a content standard is really a performative expression of a knowing and not exactly the knowing itself. I was at a Kent Laboratory Academy a couple of weeks ago, and one of the teachers there, her name is Angela Boston, she said that what we're really teaching is the truth inside of the content standard. And I thought that was deep, right? And so part of it is we need to know what it is we want our kids to know. And there's some strategies that we have for arriving at that. Because ultimately, right, what we're doing is we are building bridges to what it is we want our kids to know and understand. And, Katie, you mentioned analogies. All right, so, okay, I'm in my own workspace, right? So I got my books around me. All right, so again, another book I'm not recommending, but my fourth favorite cognitive scientist is Douglas Hofstadter. I'm a normal person, and that's why I rank my favorite cognitive scientist. My fourth favorite cognitive scientist is Douglas Hofstadter, and he talks about the cognition core hypothesis. And so essentially he says that all thinking is a kind of analogy making. When we are thinking and looking to make sense of the world, we have to ask ourselves, we're asking ourselves, like, what is this like? What does this remind me of? And so when we go deep into a learning target, right? The true learning target, not just the performative expression of the learning target. When we go deep into the learning target and we start to unpack it, we're giving ourselves a chance to expose some of our own implicit biases about both the learning target and also the processes by which the learning target can be understood. And so if we're not thinking really carefully about what it is we want our kids to know, not just what we want them to be able to repeat on a quiz and an exam, but 5 years from now, what do I want my students to still know? When I can do a deep dive into that, I am more likely to be able to expose multiple pathways that might have been beyond just my own social or cultural frame of reference. That's one part of what I would say to that. And I think then the other part of the work, the majority of teachers in the state of Washington are white and women. I have no problem with that, but there's a kind of responsibility that comes with that, which is you got to put yourself in a position where you can recognize what it feels like to occupy a position of other in a social space that requires something of me. It can't just be a space where you're going to be a passive kind of observer of activity, right? What we're asking our students to do is to be actively engaged. And what one of our ways of being able to extend these invitations to our kids is you got to be familiar with what it feels like to question whether or not your cultural fluencies are going to be useful to you in demonstrating your competence in this environment that matters to you. So I think that the other part of this work is, right, we were talking about knowing who our kids are as cultural beings. We need to know who we are as cultural beings. The extent to which I am aware of who I am as a cultural being makes it more likely that I'll be able to recognize some of the limitations of my lens, my social lens, my cultural lens, because the limitations of my lens can be experienced by my students as a closed door, as a partially constructed bridge where they can bring their full self and demonstrating their competence in coming to understand.
There was a really good question about, gosh, like I absolutely see the value of this, but how is a teacher meant to do it? And I would argue that it's not a teacher that's meant to do it, that some of the systems work is building in more time for these professional learning communities and this collective efficacy or common planning. And I think the traditional system loved to compartmentalize students. So, I'm a mom of 4 kids. One of my daughter has some significant support needs. And my daughter, let me make this very clear, with disabilities is not the property of a special education department. And students who might have unexpected behaviors are not the property of the adjustment counselor. You know, students who are learning English as an additional language, they're not the property of the ELL department. And for too long, we operated in those silos. And that meant as a general education teacher, I was like the pediatrician who didn't do sick visits, for goodness sake, right? It's like, oh my gosh, look at how great my data is. Well, you don't see any kids who like need support. Like, this is bananas. So when we're talking about general education, of which I was a general educator, I might not have the expertise to think about or help students to communicate the pathways or the strategies or the tools, but I sure as heck know my colleagues do. And so it's about me not having the power to design a class that excludes students, but rather how do we together recognize the barriers to ensure that we don't need separate programs, locations to get students what they need. And inclusive programming, of which is universally designed and culturally responsive, right? That happens because the system has made an effort to pull teachers together. And so I think that if you think about how does one single teacher within a class truly understand what does the highest level of acceleration look like, so those pathways are available to all kids, while also ensuring the linguistic supports are there, also ensuring that the specially designed instruction is aligned to student needs on IEPs, like that would be too much to ask someone, but it's not too much to ask everyone if they work together. And I also think that for too long, teachers thought of themselves as being content experts as opposed to designers of learning who also have content expertise. So one of the things that has been a real barrier in traditional systems is like, as an English teacher, I have nothing to learn from math teachers. And that's simply not true. Is we all teach kids. We all have goals. We all have instructional methods. And the more we can lean into each other, which sometimes the system prevents us from doing that, that's how we meet the needs of all kids, because the programming in the therapeutic classroom should be in every classroom, but I need time with that teacher. The programming in a life skills classroom should be provided in every location. And that is what an inclusive system is really all about. It's dependent upon this tier 1 environment that does in fact meet the needs of all students, not from an adult perspective of like, I know you well enough to know exactly what you need from my very limited privileged worldview, but that I am willing to ensure that whatever you need is provided to you here. And my colleagues will help us to do that. And that is like the number one biggest, driver of student achievement. If you're looking at visible learning, is just, do we believe that together we can meet the needs of all kids?
I think that planning is the high leverage behavior. And this is one of the reorgs that we have to do as we are imagining public education differently. Yeah, I've seen and I have this firm belief that a teacher of any racial, ethnic, gendered, or language background can be the best teacher ever for any kid of any combination of racial, ethnic, language, or gendered background. I think that planning is the high leverage behavior. And yet, Katie, I couldn't agree more that when we get teams together on the same page, we give them the structure, the support, the tools to be able to design well, we end up getting this kind of value added that not only yields richer learning experiences for kids, but it makes the practice of planning and just this experience of teaching a much richer and much more rewarding. I saw a question about my 3 top cognitive scientists. Can I answer that real quick?
Yeah.
All right, so look, this is almost a silly question.
If you take out 3 books that quickly, that's amazing.
I'm not going to take out all 3 because I got a couple of them on ebooks. But number 3, Daniel Willingham, Why Don't Students Like School? Daniel Willingham, University of Virginia, number 3, was one of the first people to really bring cognitive science to the mainstream of the teacher world. Number 2, and I am going to recommend her book, my number 2 cognitive scientist is Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she has a great book out called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. I highly recommend that book for every educator. It's a great book for parents too. And the number 1, come on, that goes without saying. What are we even talking about? Clearly, Mary Helen Imordino Yang of the University of Southern California. That's just a no-brainer. She's the pioneer in the subfield of affective neuroscience. What are we talking about? That's a silly question. Whoever asked that, number 1, that's a given.
I am so angry at myself that I haven't been writing down the names of all of these books, so I hope someone has. Yes, Carissa, same thing.
We'll get those for you, Katie. We'll get those for you. I did order one of those books. It's I haven't read it yet, but it's on my shelf. We're gonna get there. It's like you guys are in my brain. I was just gonna ask you, what are the barriers that need to be overcome in order to truly have more equitable, inclusive schools? And so I really heard really this belief that, you know, these are my kids in my room and I'm serving them. And really, how do we really redefine that these are all of our students that we want to see successful, and every single one of us that get the opportunity, the privilege to serve these young people can bring our unique gifts to be able to serve them. And then I heard planning as the high leverage activity. Is there anything else that you would add that are also, I mean, we could spend all day talking about this, but really thinking about, if we're speaking to educators who are really thinking about implementing shifting their frameworks, looking at universal design for learning and culturally responsive practices, would you say there's other barriers that need to be addressed, or are those kind of the
Yes. So that is the work of which so when you're looking at the state's lens of building a multi-tiered system of support, that's a really good frame to think about all the potential barriers from a systems lens. So when we're talking about implementation science, we're generally talking about three different areas or three different drivers, right? You have your leadership drivers, and I'll talk about what those are, your competency drivers, and then your implementation drivers. So I'm going to put that right in the chat for those of you who, like me, I like to go back and look at the chat. So we have leadership, we have competency, and then we have implementation. So your leadership drivers are things like, do you have kind of a shared vision for this work? Building a culture at a school where there's not competition among teachers, but rather really making an effort to think about how do we work together to meet the needs of all kids, which requires very, very strong leadership as opposed to like more of like a compliance based. It's also about resource allocation. So we know our districts are not going to get more money. So how are we using that money to best leverage this collective work to make sure that we have the staff that has the appropriate training to make sure that they can be a part of the collective work of eliminating barriers. And it's also about family and community engagement. I saw a mom had posted something saying like, it feels like it would be really beneficial for parents to know that this is valued and the district is moving in that direction. So your leadership drivers are a lot about shared responsibility. It's about culture. It's about strategic planning to make sure that you recognize what you don't have for resources and staff, and then that you have a plan to build those. Your competency drivers are much more about how do we build a skill set so our staff has what they need to feel prepared to meet the needs of all kids. So these are things like professional learning communities, common planning, instructional coaching, instructional rounds. We've been talking about book clubs, but like we do have to continue to support the learning of educators because what we're required to do is always evolving. And then we have our implementation drivers, which are more of the technical supports. Do we have technology? Do we have really high quality, culturally responsive curriculum, or does our curriculum have the potential to cause harm? Do we have really great sources of very quick objective data? Because I want to know very quickly, are my design decisions having a positive impact on kids without over testing them, or like, I don't want them in front of screens all the time. But so all of those pieces, if you don't have them, create barriers. So if you don't have the high quality curriculum, if you don't have the schedule that allows time for common planning. And, another really important thing is that having common planning means that it's an inclusive team. So I work with a lot of districts who tell me, oh, we have common planning. I'm like, is the English language learning support teacher there? Is the special educator there? Is the adjustment counselor there? Is the physical therapist, occupational therapist, go on and on. Oh no, that's when they teach. That's not a common planning period, because you cannot have inclusive classrooms if you do not have inclusive planning. And so I think a lot of districts kind of nationally are moving to change full school calendars, where I'm starting to work with more and more districts in like many, many states who are doing things like an hour late start once a week or an hour early release once a week. So no one is teaching at that time, and you truly get entire teams together, not necessarily to talk about specific students, but what are the barriers that students are facing, what are the voices of students and families facing, and then, you know, leaning into the collective expertise of saying, how do we do this better?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, here's the other thing. I don't want to get disappeared, but I think our paradigm for high stakes standardized testing is a barrier. We know that the most reliable predictor of achievement as measured by high stakes standardized tests is zip code. And therefore, we have kind of, I think, exhausted what it is we can learn from the current paradigm, but there's a problem, an equity problem that I meet head to head. Very often I'll go into a school and I'll be saying some of these things that I think Katie says and that I say, and teachers will say, you know, this is groovy, right? Like, I would love to be able to teach like this, and it sounds like the right thing to do, but I'm worried about how it might affect my test scores. And I say, aha, that's the evidence that the tests are evil, because anything that would discourage you from doing what your teacher's soul says is good for kids has got to be at the very least problematic. And so I think the assessment of our environment is also another barrier. Now, you know, my focus is on the classrooms, right? So I'm working with teachers, trying to figure out how can teachers be as effective as possible with the learners that they are serving every single day. And so in the classroom, but I think that this extends, I don't know how to kick it upstairs, because I also don't know that people who are not dealing with kids every day, I can't, so you're gonna cut my mic off. I don't know that people who don't deal with kids every day have the same skin in the game in terms of instruction that district level and state level administrators have. How can you, when you are thinking about kids, you are looking at kids as data points on, you know, charts and graphs. And when teachers are looking at kids and thinking about kids, you're thinking about stories, you're thinking about relationships, you're thinking about dreams. So there's this kind of micro, macro disconnect that is a barrier in and of itself. And I think one of the ways that it manifests is in terms of assessments. And so what I say to my classroom teachers is, we should be striving for an assessment environment that is performative as possible, meaning when we understand something, the understanding doesn't just live in our brains, the understanding shows up in our behavior. You perform your understanding as much or more than you articulate it. And so project-based learning experiences, which should inherently require cross-discipline planning, portfolios, which show work and growth and understanding over time, and capstone projects where students get to deal with novel problems and employ strategic reasoning and extend their thinking so that they can connect multiple content areas. So, you know, I feel very strongly about the fact that we are saying one thing in terms of what we want for kids in the classroom, but then we have this fundamental disconnect at the level of the state and nationally, which is a very different way of assessing what we might call competence. These high stakes standardized tests, I think, are absolutely a barrier to equitable and culturally responsive teaching in classrooms.
Thank you. So what I hear you really sharing is that policymakers need to listen to the teachers, need to listen to folks that are on the front line and in the classrooms.
You know, actually, Brooke, I would say policymakers, you need to get in the classroom. You need to co-plan a lesson. Policymakers, superintendents, assistant superintendents, right now on this listening to this webinar, find a teacher, co-plan with that teacher a learning experience, get in the classroom, crisscross applesauce on the carpet, feel it, feel what is or is not working for students, and then reflect with the teacher, and then develop your policy position from the experience of doing what policy is intended to do. Policy is intended to support good instruction for kids. And so you need to have a current frame of reference for what good, rigorous, engaging, meaningful instruction for kids feels like, so that you can arrange the policy environment accordingly.
And I have always been very vocal about the fact that standardized tests are designed to be exclusionary. It's not so much saying like, let's see how everyone's doing on a shared measure, you know, common assessments, things like that. My biggest issue is that the tools all of us have as adults in real life are not offered to students. So like as professional writers, I can use voice to text. I can use spell check. I am not timed on my ability to write. Like all of these different things. And I think that the struggle here is just that federal legislation, the Every Student Succeeds Act, does say that standardized assessments need to be universally designed, and they're not yet. And if they were universally designed and students had opportunities to take the tests in multiple language, we offer language minority support for voting. So why are we not providing language minority support on standardized tests? Like, it looks as though it's an act of defiance to acknowledge that students have other languages. And, you know, the work of translanguaging is recognizing that we can create multilingual classrooms that will ultimately lead students to learning English as an additional language. But the idea is not to replace the language of their hearts and their homes. And so for me, what's so troublesome about these standardized tests is simply that students don't have access to the same tools and strategies that they will have at any other point in their lives. And I think that that is a struggle, absolutely, when we're designing instruction and people are saying, I don't want to give students the read alouds. I don't want to allow them to talk in their first language. I don't want to give them these examples and non-examples because they won't have them on the test. And so, you know, for me, like, my hopeful view is that, like, we're going to, number one, see way more places go test optional, go test blind, and it's going to take the legs out from this like really long journey of high stake testing that follows us into our teaching career and prevents some amazing people from becoming teachers because we don't have access to the tools that are rightfully ours. The other issue and the other story that I want to tell you is that Massachusetts, oh my gosh, it was so bad a couple of years ago. I'm from Massachusetts, and the State Department of Ed literally on our website said world's best, because if Massachusetts was a country, we performed the best in the world on the international PISA, right? Very high performing district, very high performing state, right? 3 years ago, our state standardized test got thrown out because we have a high stakes test. You have to pass it to graduate high school. And on our English high stakes test, which I have no idea how many people signed off on this, but you can look it up. I'll put the link in it. As soon as I'm done talking, I'll put the link in it and you can go down that rabbit hole. But what is so frustrating is the prompt. It sounds like I'm making this up. The prompt was to read an excerpt from Colton Whitehead's Underground Railroad, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, and rewrite a passage from an openly racist character's point of view. In the highest performing state, on a high stakes exam, with goodness knows how many people looked at that question. And it ended up getting thrown out. There was no high stake test that year. And I think that we have to look at things like that and say, what are we actually trying to measure? And what do these scores mean? And I think we have to do a lot more work of saying, if we are going to have this shared opportunity, this portfolio system, or even a common assessment, how do we ensure that we can't predict who's going to do well on that assessment based on their zip code and identity, which right now we can. And I'm going to put that link in there so you can see that disgustingness.
Yeah, these are, you know, and the thing is, right, Katie, is that we people know that this is true. And so, you know, like, the obstacle is something much more insidious, right, than just a disagreement in terms of how do we, you know, capture what we measure. And again, I'm putting pressure, you know, my people are teachers. And so I'm really only interested in being friends with teachers, right? So if you're, I don't mean to be disrespectful to superintendent types, but, you know, what I like to say to you is, you know, superintendents, you're the ones, assistant superintendents, you're the ones who I think your voice carries a great deal of weight in terms of pushing back against these limiting notions of assessment. And I always say to superintendents, I'll believe, superintendents, that you believe that high stakes standardized tests are a quality and effective measure of teaching and learning when superintendents agree to take an annual high stakes standardized superintendent's test. And so, Kate, to your point, you know, in terms of being able to use the resources to demonstrate the competence, you know, this is something that our policymakers, our decision makers, you would get this if you were, right now, I'm in Colorado. I got a group of Black and brown boys that I mentor, and they're all sick from the test that they're taking right now. So, you know, like we would get religion if we had to be subjected to these same measures that we are imposing on kids. So we already know that these tests don't encourage equitable instruction and don't give us timely feedback to answer the problems of practice that are most pressing. So, you know, there are other reasons why we are continuing to be beholden to these old structures.
Another like amazing example is I was working with a state Department of Ed who was pushing back on the concept of standardized tests as life skill. And what the person said to me was, you know what, sometimes you just have to pay your taxes. And I'm like, what a great example of UDL. Thank you for posing that. Because like, yes, we do all have to file our taxes. That is actually true. Think about all the different pathways and supports you have to file your taxes, right? It's like, first of all, you get to decide paper, you could do it online, you can do it TurboTax, you can do an accountant. It's offered in like 260 languages. And so like, there's just so much flexibility. And then like you can file an extension or, you know, you can pay quarterly. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is the exact opposite of the point that you're trying to make. That I do think it's fair to say, show us what you've learned in a common way, because we want to make sure that we're having a desired impact on you. But when we can predict what that is, or when that creates so many barriers and doesn't reflect the level of flexibility that we have in every other high stakes thing in our entire world, that's what's problematic about it. And again, the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 said the test had to be universally designed. And what a lot of tests, or a lot of state tests did, was they offered accommodations if you had them in your IEP. That is not universally designed. Universally designed they're offered to everyone, and kids can choose whether or not to use them, not an adult. And so a universally designed test would think about what might students need to truly show their knowledge, their true comprehension of text. Translations, read alouds, voice to text, spell checks, because we are living in 2022, and I use those to publish all of my work. And don't feel bad about it at all.
Brooke, I want to say just one more thing. I know you probably want to move on here. So I want to bring this back to the classroom. An assessment that is culturally responsive, because I don't think Katie and I are arguing against assessments. We're saying we want to assess. It's important to assess, but we need meaningful assessments. We need responsive assessments. And so one of the ways that I think about a culturally responsive assessment is a culturally responsive assessment allows students to draw from their cultural fluencies in order to show what they understand. And so when we are giving our students performative and responsive assessments, they are able to use their assets in order to demonstrate their competencies. They are not successful in spite of their background. They're successful because of their background. And so I want to be clear, right, that we're not arguing that we shouldn't be assessing. Again, I think that I'm a fan of rigor when we're talking about rigor in the right way. No, what we want is we want assessments that give all of our students those fair and meaningful opportunities to show you this understanding that I've gathered, not by compartmentalizing my identity, but by reaching into every aspect of myself to show you what I know. And so that's, when the pandemic came, we should have been able to encourage kids to continue to stay engaged, even with the disruption in school, by pointing to the assessments. We should have been able to say, you've been working so hard in your portfolios. Come on now, everybody, we got to keep it going. I know it's hard. Or this problem-based, the PBL project that we've been working on. Come on, we've come too far to let this fall by the wayside just because some old little silly pandemic. And an assessment, a truly responsive assessment, should be an incentive to engage. It shouldn't be something that we have to cajole students into doing.
Thank you so much. Again, you're like in my brain. I mean, bringing it back to instruction and thinking about that graphic that Katie or Dr. Novak shared earlier about belief systems, skill sets, and system drivers. I'd love to think about this is to get to problem-based learning, to get to culturally responsive assessments. That's going to require our teachers to implement some instructional changes. And so what or how can we really support teachers in implementing those instructional changes with those different lenses? I think about in our district, we have three sort of instructional priorities that talk about standards-based instruction, culture responsive practices, and universal design for learning. And all three are interconnected and important. And if we just focus on one, right, it's missing. They all work together. And so I'd love to think about how we can support teachers to implement those in important instructional changes.
And I think all of them really have to do with barriers to the traditional system and traditional pedagogy. Is that a lot of people think of universal design as something that's simply for students who have disabilities to access instruction, and to not recognize that there are so many additional barriers. And so if you're looking at a framework to say what's preventing kids from being able to learn and share what they know in alignment to really rigorous standards, and we start to list those things, and we have to think about, like, how do we minimize those? So, racism is a barrier. So we lean into anti-racist practice, right? Learning English, because the system so heavily privileges English speaking and not language in general, right? We know that it's a barrier because instruction is mostly only offered in English, right? So we learn strategies that make instruction more linguistically appropriate, which is all about, sheltered English immersion, or, we provide a lot more support. But then there's this concept of translanguaging as well, which is like, why wouldn't we encourage students to use all the different sources of language they have as they're learning and sharing what they know? So I think that if we look at right now, many students are not learning because learning isn't accessible, learning is not trauma-informed, you have all of these things. It does require a really robust skill set to be able to eliminate those. And I think that a lot of the times, one of the things that I always say is, like, we don't work for curriculum. Curriculum works for us, right? And so I am a huge supporter of, like, high quality, flexible curriculum materials. But, like, ultimately, I don't have to do what the curriculum tells me to do. And I think that even sometimes we adopt curriculum that has the potential to harm students, that doesn't have a low enough floor or a high enough ceiling for true access and engagement. And people feel like they can't change that. And once you're building that understanding of what does it mean to be culturally responsive, what does it mean to be, to universally design, I think all of those allow us to truly make the curriculum work for kids. And, like, I don't want to create lessons from scratch, absolutely not. But you also can't expect to see all this growth just by buying a curriculum. It would be like, hey, contractor, I bought you a bunch of tools. Good luck. But you don't just let the tools do the work. You'd be like, your house isn't going to get built that way. So, like, how do we ensure that teachers have really great materials so that they can spend their time building the skill set? Because right now they're spending the time making materials that the district should have purchased already. And I feel like a huge systemic barrier is that teachers are under-resourced, which takes away time for actual planning to meet the needs of all kids, which again is a systems problem, not a teacher problem.
Yeah, I'd concur. I think that, once upon a time, I had this great opportunity to study these schools that were at the top of the list for sending racial and ethnic minority students who were the first in their family to go to college, who also qualified for full Pell Grants. So we found these high schools that had prepared this population of students for successful freshman English and math course taking in college. And got to go and spend this time in these schools. They were all across the country. And for me, the kind of key takeaway that I took from these schools that were successful in preparing this vulnerable population of students to go on and do well in post-secondary learning opportunities is, again, right, they spent a lot of time talking about good teaching. And, I had a very embarrassing, it was instructive. My first year of teaching, I was hanging out in the teacher's lounge, and I was complaining about my students because how can they not appreciate me and all the great, wonderful learning opportunities I'm bringing to them. And I was kind of sitting there, moaning and groaning and dumping on students. And the teacher, who was one of my boys, his name is Sylvester Freeman, he kind of checked me and he said, Mr. Stembridge, we don't talk about students like that here. And then he modeled for me a better way of starting to problem solve some of the problems of practice that I was experiencing in the classroom. And so, I would just say, in addition to everything that Katie said, right, these are places where we have to be able to have high-level conversations about teaching. School is a place where you should go. A good school is a place where you should go and be exposed to lots of smart ideas about teaching. And then again, I'm going to put some pressure on building administrators, and I'm going to say, you've got to make it possible for teachers in your building to see other teachers in your building teach. If teaching is the central thing that we do, if this is the most important part of this program, then we should be celebrating and learning from these models of promising practice within our building. And so, a lot of times teachers, you go a whole year and never go into another teacher's classroom. And so I think it's that combination of being able to get into each other's rooms, see what's working for our students, right? Because that's not an abstraction. These are our kids, the kids who we know. I know their names. I see them in the hallway. I teach their siblings. I need to know what's working for them. And I need to have access and opportunity to have these high-level conversations about what we mean by good teaching.
So I hear you saying that kind of having these common understandings, language, and definition of what good teaching is important. And really thinking about access to resources and being flexible in the way that those resources are used, and sort of acknowledging the professionalism of the educators that are doing the teaching. And so one of the things that I think is really important as we are shifting and really thinking about the resources that we use in our classroom and the curriculum that we adopt is really thinking about, how do we get to know our students so that we are selecting what they really need? How do we get to know their assets, their strengths? How do we meaningfully learn beyond just a get to know you survey or a checklist? How do we really, as educators, how do we support other educators continuing to do that, to build those meaningful relationships?
I mean, I think there's lots of really amazing strategies. So relationship mapping is really important, like taking the time throughout the year. Dare I say data meetings, but like every 6 weeks, really thinking about which kids do I have a really great relationship with and which kids have I not connected with yet. And then doing some, silent mentoring, so to speak. So when I taught 7th grade, about 6 weeks into the year, we had anyone who taught 7th grade, right? And including people who drove buses and were in the office and were in the cafeteria. And we would take time to bring every single person together, and we would just have pictures of every single kid. And you had to go around, and it was like 5 stickers for the kids that you felt that you had the strongest relationship with, 5 green stickers for kids you had a really good relationship with, yellow stickers for kids you were actually concerned about and felt like you should build a relationship with. And it was amazing. Of the same kids, people are blue, 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 blue. Like the more gregarious, the ones who would make more of an effort to connect with teachers, right? So like there's things that you can do for relationship mapping. I think I'm a huge fan of Cogent Dialogues. That's Chris Emden's work, which is essentially like pulling in groups of students to say, how do we make this class better? And making sure that it's something that they can opt into, that once they feel like they've said their word, they can nominate someone else. And I'm also, when we're talking about curriculum, I am a huge, huge, huge supporter of students completing rubrics on all curriculum pilots. That ultimately the work is about them. And I think a lot of times we take the time to have parents and the community members come in and look at materials. Certainly teachers are always encouraged to share their feedback, but really asking students to experience multiple curriculums and then to give them an opportunity to share which of them challenged them, which of them created harm, and using that to make an ultimate decision and being transparent about what we chose and how it impacted kids.
Yeah, so like I'm theoretically, right, my first kind of thought is, in order to be really good at seeing our students' assets, you've got to challenge in your own mind the kind of difference versus deficit interpretations that we impose on people, right? And so a lot of times when I see, and this is again just part of what it means to be human, we're a tribal species. We've evolved to kind of see connections and similarities in other people. And when we see connections and similarities in other people, what our brains do, what our tribal brains do is it tells us, that that person is more like me. And that person, since they're more like me, I'm going to give them kind of more benefit of the doubt to find kind of rationale into what they're saying or what they're doing. And so one of the things that we have to just really be mindful about, I think first is theoretically, and this is an ongoing life skill, is to decouple in our own minds the interpretation of deficit when we see difference. Because a lot of times I'm able to identify the assets of my students when, oftentimes it comes in the form of a bad behavior. I'm from the Bronx, New York, and like if I would have had a teacher, even the kindest teacher, most committed teacher, tell me that I shouldn't fight in the Bronx, like I just would have looked at you like you were disconnected and not living in the same world that I was living in, which is not an endorsement of the bad behavior of fighting in schools. It's I would have loved to have had a teacher when I was in elementary school who would have seen my fighting as a kind of evidence of an asset, the unwillingness to let myself be pushed around. And so like if I can get a teacher that I can have a relationship with, someone who I see as trustworthy and who commits to see assets, even in the form of some of my bad behaviors, that teacher could have helped me to keep that will to not be picked on alive and develop different tools other than fighting in school, which were always going to get me in trouble, to give me other tools to help to manifest, to live out that asset. That's one way of thinking. That's one idea that comes to mind. Here's the other thing though, as an English teacher, and I've seen other teachers do this really well also. Teachers, do an assignment with your students. Now you're doing an assignment with your students. So I'm going to write, an essay that I'm assigning to my kids. I'm going to write an essay with my students. Now here's the reason why I'm doing it. Number one, if I've got a pretty good relationship with my students, then they're going to see in my model a way of being for how they can show up in a challenging learning experience. So I become a kind of model to them for how to engage. But I think more importantly, what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to understand who my students are as thinkers. The more that I can understand who my students are as thinkers, the better I'm going to be able to create those bridges to really bolster their understandings. I did in my book, at the beginning of every chapter, I tell a classroom story. The story that I tell at the beginning of chapter 5 is called Productive Struggle. The teacher in that room, her name was Miss Allen. She's a coach now in the Cherry Creek School District in Colorado. And what I was so impressed about in that productive struggle learning experience was Miss Allen knew who every one of her students were as math thinkers. And so she knew, she could anticipate which strategy, standard algorithm, the array model, right? She could predict which strategy would be her students' go-to strategy. And therefore we were able to present a challenging problem for the kids because we wanted them to practice some of these tools for struggling productively. So, it's really nice when we can see these superficial assets of our students, but when we're talking about assets, Brooke, what I'm really asking teachers to do is, you got to know how your kids problem solve when their backs up against the wall. What's their go-to disposition? What are the skills and the areas of background knowledge and knowing that they're likely to draw on when we are asking them to think hard and to work hard and to be vulnerable in the learning experience? And so knowing the assets, knowing what our students knowing who they are as these capable beings and how that shows up in the classroom, I think that that requires us working alongside with them and giving ourselves a chance to think, elbow to elbow with them so we can learn who they are as thinkers.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really connects to a comment Katie made earlier about us being the designers of learning opportunities as we have expertise in content. And so really understanding our students and recognizing their humanity as we understand how they engage with the content, and really valuing both pieces of them as thinkers and as scholars. All right, I have another question. This is kind of the last question before we head into our participant questions at 12:30. And it's like, what would you suggest that a teacher or administrator do tomorrow to begin moving towards equitable and inclusive instruction?
I love this question. I think tomorrow you simply ask your learners, right? This is my favorite prompt ever. Okay, so I'm gonna put it in the chat because this is my favorite. It would be great if, right? So I think that some people may not be in the place right now where you are ready for your class to tell you everything you're doing wrong, right? like, you know, teachers are working super, super hard right now, and like opening up to be like, what's wrong with this class is heartbreaking. One of the things that I like to end my sessions with is like, listen, you know, I would love to know, like, what is one idea for something that I could do? And I always say, imagine that I'm going to work with you again tomorrow. Complete the sentence, it would be great if. And I've done this with like first graders. I've done this with adults. And I think that that's such like a great sentence frame, because people will be like, oh, it would be so great if we had more time to work on that. It would be great if you gave us a break. It would be so great if we could choose our own book. It would be great if we could work together, right? And in that one prompt, you can kind of thematically code, and then the next day almost say like, thank you so much for those ideas. You know, a couple of you thought that it would be really great if we did this. So let's give some framing to why this might be a good decision. Let's talk about the option, and then like, do you feel like this would be beneficial for you today, and why? And I actually worked with the educators. If anyone right now is on this call that worked on this project, you have to let us know. But we did this would you rather project. I don't know if you've heard of like, you know, would you rather swim in lemonade or would you rather swim in, you know, chocolate? My kids are like obsessed with those right now. And we went in and we talked about what are some places where you can begin to offer, you know, options and choices to students through this would you rather frame. And I can't wait to share it with you because it's so, so amazing. And it was created by the educators in the Washington Educator Association. So I'm going to put this in the chat right now, but essentially use people's suggestions about what they think would be beneficial for their learning, for their challenge. And then as a next step, provide it to them in a would you rather. So some of you noted yesterday that it felt a little long because I kept talking. Would you rather take a break at the beginning or would you rather take a break in the middle, right? And we're starting to build these options and choices, but we are co-creating those options and choices, which some people thought like, gosh, how do you find the time to do that? So look for that in the chat in a minute while Dr. Stembridge answers the question.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to just direct my thought here to teachers because those are my people. So teachers, the question that you can ask yourself about the lesson that you're giving tomorrow is, what do you want your students to feel? What do you want your students to feel? How do I want my students to experience this emotionally? What's the affective context in which they're learning? And I think generally that question, what do I want my students to feel? It's not going to answer all of what I might need to be thinking about in terms of the design of the learning experience, but it's going to put me in the right direction. It's going to certainly give you a chance to recognize, more likely recognize what your kids' assets are, more likely to be able to give them an experience that invites the whole of their being. Yeah, that'd be like, I would also say, you know, you're whack if you think that there's one question that you can ask yourself that's going to make you culturally responsive tomorrow. But that's where I would start. That would be one place where I could start.
So I hear you both really saying this is a process. This is not something that we're just going to arrive at tomorrow. We're going to show up with our UDL and culture responsive practice hat on and be ready to go. So it's a process. It's something that is best done in community with one another and including our students. So I think that's really great. And so I'm going to be selfish as a facilitator and just ask each of you a question that I always like to ask, and thinking about what's the last great book that you read, and then we'll transition into panel questions.
I have to grab, I mean, you keep grabbing books. I have to grab my book now. So this honestly was the last book that I read. It's called Bias, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. And I think that this book does an amazing job of just saying we're all incredibly biased. Let's get over that. And let's start to recognize some of our bias and how those biases actually create really significant barriers for other people, but they're also really significant barriers for our own growth and our own relationships. It was a really, really fast read. Like, it was beautifully done. But I think that a lot of people really struggle with the concept of white privilege. And this just kind of comes out from the beginning and saying, like, we are all biased. Saying that you're not biased or being embarrassed about your bias is ridiculous, and some really great concrete examples of that. So I would highly recommend this if you're working with colleagues that are really struggling to recognize that our success is often defined by our identity. And I would argue always defined by our identity. And I think that one thing that I definitely struggle with is, like, I recognize that I'm a successful person, but I am not the hardest worker and I am not the smartest person. And I don't think that at all. And I think that we have to push back on this bias that the people who are successful somehow earned that success, as opposed to a path was made much easier. Like, sure, I'm smart enough. Sure, I work kind of hard, but like, there are so many people who work so much harder than me that just don't have the opportunities that I had. And not seeing that is the greatest form of bias.
Your question is stressing me out, Brooke.
You've already shown us like 17 books. Just pull one of them back up.
Yeah, but you asked
one, Yemi. It's okay. You can give us a couple, but we do, you know.
I'm feeling attacked. This is unpleasant. So, I love this book I read by Joe Henrich called The Secret of Our Success, which Joe Henrich is a cultural psychologist and an anthropologist. And he's talking about how culture has played this profound role in the shaping of our species. So the secret of our success, our referring to the human species. So yeah, that's a book that I read twice. I read it back to back. I really dig the way he's using a mixed methodological approach to point to the role that culture plays in our humanity. And then I would say the other one, but I can't recommend this other book because it's too long, but I love this book, is Behave by Robert Sapolsky. And Robert Sapolsky is an endocrinologist and a primatologist. And in the book, the premise of the book is that a behavior has occurred, and he asks, okay, this behavior has occurred, trivial or non-trivial, right? And let's ask what was happening seconds before the behavior that gives context to the behavior. That's like chapter 2. And then chapter 3 is what's happening minutes before the behavior that gives context for the behavior. And then what's happening hours before the behavior. And chapter 9 was my favorite chapter in that book. That's the culture chapter. What's happening hundreds of years to a millennia before the behavior that gives context to the behavior. But I can't recommend Behave because the book is too long. It's like 790 pages too long, which is too long, Robert Sapolsky. I love the book, but come on, dude, that's like 3 books. So I'll go with The Secret of Our Success by Joe Henrich. But I give that answer with, I'm offering that answer under protest because I feel stressed out by that question.
I didn't mean to cause you stress, Dr. Stembridge. Please don't hold it against me. We just, great minds want to know what y'all have been reading. And I'll just share that my last book that I read was 4 Pivots by Dr. Sean Ginwright, which I absolutely adore, and I would recommend to everyone to read that book as well. So we're going to transition into Katie, I saw you unmute. Did you have something you wanted to add before we transition to questions? Okay, perfect.
If I did, it's gone, long gone.
Okay. I just want to make sure. All right. So we have a whole bunch of questions, and probably not enough time, but we're going to do our best. We have about 25 minutes before we start our wrap up. And so, all right, I'm just going to jump right in. Is that okay? Okay, so one of the panelists, or one of the participants asked, I see so much desire, folks, to get back to normal as we move forward from the pandemic, but I'm also seeing this time as an opportunity to look at shifting systems and practice with more of a CRE, UDL, disability justice framework. How do we support folks in not just rubber banding back into what they felt was comfortable and help them get comfortable with a more inclusive and stronger new normal?
I mean, what we know is normal didn't work. Like we're holding on to something that was so largely ineffective. And the fact that people were working so hard and we weren't having a desired impact shows simply that like what we had done, the former system, wasn't working. And I think that people call that system broken. And like, I want to push back. I don't think the system is broken. I think it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was a system for privilege. And we need to break it by using these practices that we're talking about. But I ultimately think that, you know, the work of being driven by evidence and data is not just about let's only care about these big tests at the end, but like, how do we create a practice where we're constantly looking at multiple forms of data, classroom observations, cogent dialogues, you know, family and community engagement surveys, all of that. What is our impact on kids and what do we want it to be? And it's not that right now, which means we have to do something different. So I would basically push back, and anyone who's saying like, let's just go back to the way it was before, like we can look at the data from the way it was before and nobody should be comfortable with those outcomes.
Yeah, and I'm with you on the evidence piece. You know, I'm a big fan of the Japanese lesson study model, where we do a deep dive into lessons. I think, you know, we also need to have a kind of, you know, student work model where we do, and I know we do, we need to do a deep dive into looking at students' work. And so I think part of what we have to do is we have to get inspired differently than we were before the pandemic. This is an incredible opportunity. That's one way of looking at it. But if we can't show what it is that we think represents more responsive, more universal design, then many people won't be able to imagine it. So I say you gotta start with, you gotta like do something that works for kids, that meets the goals of the learning experience, that embodies rigor, that is meaningful for students. And then we take the evidence of that, we take students' work, and then we show it, and we tell the story. We do a deep dive telling of the story. What's the evidence that students are engaged, right? Not just behavioral engagement, but that emotional engagement, that cognitive engagement as well. What's the evidence that students are engaged? When we're looking at this student's work, what's working for kids? And then, you know, what does this require of us? I think that a lot of people they are now currently in a place where they would evolve their practices, but we have to provide some exemplars and some illustrations, and, you know, and again, not static illustrations, right? You got to bring them in and let them get inside of the story of this so that teachers can imagine themselves teaching this way.
Awesome, thank you. All right, another question that sort of connects to that idea of rethinking how we're doing school and really focusing on things that we know it didn't work, and now we're focusing on really, right, the art, right? Being creative, trying a different way. One of the questions, it says, parents and communities are increasingly challenging library and instructional content that would support diverse students' identities and needs. As an acronym, CRT made something different to some, critical race theory. How do we meaningfully engage parents so they are partners, not opponents to necessary change?
I think one of the difficult things is there will be some parents who are opposers of necessary change. We do not exist in an echo chamber. And I think that the goal of trying to get everybody to agree to a culturally responsive education is not the lens that we should take, because it prevents us from standing up for what is right for kids. And I think in my own practice, I work with a number of districts who are literally starting to pull back from using the word equity because of pushback they're getting from the family community. And my response is like, you're on the wrong side of history by doing that. And so I think that, we're talking about preventing access to books and ideas that allow kids to see themselves in the work. And I think that our leaders have to be incredibly courageous, and I do not in any way, shape, or form envy the work that you have to do, but I think that there is a huge danger in silence. And, Martin Luther King, one of his most famous quotes, and a friend of mine, Clint Smith, did this amazing TED Talk, and he talks about the danger of silence and said, like, we're not going to remember the words of our enemies as much as we're going to remember the silence of our friends. And what I would say here is that we have to stand up so every kid knows that they can walk into a library and take out a book and see themselves in those pages. And that is something that is very much, we have to be willing to fight for. And so I have a really hard time with that question, because I don't think that we're going to create an environment where everyone will agree with inclusion. I will have parents say to me, I don't think my kids should have to be in a classroom with those kids. And again, we have to choose where we're going to stand, and we have to choose who we're going to side with. And I will always be an ally for people seeing themselves and knowing that they get to choose exactly who they are, and that we will build a system that elevates and celebrates that, despite the fact that some people will never understand and will never agree.
Yeah, a lot of the pushback to equity is premised on zero-sum thinking. And I've just been in too many classrooms to believe that we cannot offer rigorous, engaging, meaningful learning experiences to every kid at the same time in a way that benefits the entire community of learners. I've seen it happen too much. I got receipts. It's like I've been a part of it, and so I think that a big, one of the obstacles here is, in many cases, a willful misunderstanding of what it is we mean by equity. I have studied this idea of equity for 20 plus years. Equity is not a new idea. Essentially, what we mean by equity is a quality and effective opportunity to learn that doesn't conflate difference with deficit and is measured by effects. This is not a controversial definition. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it's the intellectual heir to the idea of equal educational opportunity, which was the premise that originally galvanized a cross-partisan support of public schools in the United States of America. So some of the pushback relative to equity is a function of again, a willful misunderstanding, a willful misrepresentation of what it is we mean by equity. I think that in order for us to be able to do something that is more equitable for our kids, yeah, Brooke, we have to empower teachers to make those local decisions in classrooms that can be evidenced to be good for kids. And frankly, what I like to do is, when I am able to be a part of a design of a learning experience that's clearly good for kids, I like to show the students work and ask people, what would you have us do differently? And I also ask people, like, again, going back to the test scores, right? I'll say, what do you trust more? Do you trust this evidence of your students thinking of your students' work, or this decontextualized test score? So, equity is an idea that is, it's a beautiful idea. It's a dope idea, right? I mean, it's such a good idea. It hurts my feelings when I see people misrepresent the idea. But I think that if we can demonstrate that to provide opportunities for our most vulnerable doesn't compromise the opportunities that we provide to the kids who we would expect based on their demography to do well in school, when we can push back against that zero-sum limiting idea, we're going to have more traction in creating more equitable school spaces.
Yeah, so it's like shifting our mindset from a scarcity resource mindset to abundance, right? And that absolutely. All right, and so kind of in that same thread of thinking, what's an action that parents or someone who supports a student life can take to help move schools to embrace UDL and CRE? So many of these conversations need public support that requires public understanding. So how can we really build that partnership, or what are specific things that parents and supporters, community members can do?
I mean, I think school boards can be incredibly powerful to elevate this work just because we are public school systems, and that's kind of like the, a layer of setting purpose and setting vision that's going to be important. And school boards do three things in this country. They, hire and fire superintendents, they create policy, which is incredibly important for equity and inclusion, and they approve the school budget. And knowing that a shift towards some of these practices means, new curriculum and staffing and scheduling and things like that. Having them on board is incredibly important. So I would say, as a community member, reaching out to your school board to say, the work in the inclusionary practices projects is, requiring MTSS and UDL. Could we have a workshop on what UDL is? It doesn't have, no one has to have expertise, but start doing book studies with the school board. Start saying, can we do an article study? Could we have the teachers who are doing this already come and share lessons? And I think it's just recognizing that this is something that is written within the kind of state framework for doing school, I guess you could say, and it is rightfully every single child's. And I think that just coming forward and trying to highlight that this work needs to happen with a lens towards let's collective curiosity of, what is this and how can this best serve our students, I think is really powerful. And again, there's so many misconceptions. I'm going to hit on another question because I saw it right there, is so many people make incorrect connections between UDL and culturally responsive pedagogy and lots of other things. So there was a question in the chat about is UDL just learning styles? Learning styles have very clearly been debunked by lots of good research. I'm going to put a link in right now in the chat. And that is the American Psychological Association has put out a statement saying the beliefs in learning styles are detrimental. The Atlantic has written an amazing article called The Myth of Learning Styles and talks about 90% of teachers who are surveyed still believe that that is the case. And what it really is it's about shifting our language here. So students have different learning preferences and they might have different learning strengths. Learning style theory is simply that your brain is wired for only one type of learning. And that is not physiologically or biologically accurate, and it has been completely debunked. So I don't think that's a super hard conversation to have. I think it's like, oh my gosh, I still thought there was something in learning styles. And then I read the article and I was like, it's really just, we have preferences, we have strengths, but our brains aren't made where we can only possibly learn in one way, and there's no other way that we could ever learn. Even people who are blind or, visually impaired, the visual cortex of their brain is just as active. So they're not, you're not a visual learner or not a visual learner. Some people just, it's a cognitive strength to be able to picture something. So I think that just a quick sharing of that article can be really great, but helping to understand what UDL is and what culturally responsive education are, but also what they're not, is a really important part, because people tend to, UDL is the same thing as differentiated instruction. CRT, that's both culturally responsive teaching and critical race theory, which those are very, they're different frameworks, but people might not understand that. So the work is about education, it's about curiosity, it's about compassion. And if people learn what it is and still are conscientious objectors to it, then okay, but this is how we're moving forward.
In terms of building those community bridges, I always tell people, talk to teachers. Teachers, they know what's going on. They know what the needs are. They've got the firsthand experience with what the challenges are. They know. So I've got two thoughts, right? One is community. If you're a member of the community and you're interested in being a support to a more equitable learning environment, policy environment in your district, talk to teachers. And when you go to teachers, go to teachers, I mean, everybody thinks that they can teach, right? Because we all went to school, you're a community member and you think, well, wait, what are these teachers doing? I can go in there and teach that classroom. And I say, pump your brakes. When you go to the teacher, go not with the intention to lecture and maybe to speak in a condescending way. Go to teachers with the intention of learning. And then I would also flip that. So I want to shout out, there's a legendary educator in the state of Washington. She's one of my favorite people. Her name is Dr. Connie Sims. Brooke, do you know Connie Sims? You know Dr. Sims?
Not personally, but I know who she is.
I'm going to connect you. Because I want you to know who she is. She's one of my mentors. And I worked with Dr. Sims at a school in Pittsburgh about 10 years ago. She was working for Danielson and I was working at NYU. And we had teachers go into the community, and the goal of their going into the community, we partnered with several community organizations and nonprofits. And so we had people there to receive us because our goal was to go in and to learn what assets live in the community that can be leveraged in the interest of greater engagement for our kids, and then B, used as content sources. What are the content connections that live in our community so that we are able to make more relevant and responsive learning experiences for our kids? So I would say it's a two-way street, right? I would encourage any teacher watching this, recruit a couple of the teachers to come with you, go into the community. I always like, of course, you're never going to just pop up on somebody's home, right? That's not going to be pleasant, but coordinate with someone who's got relationships in the community, go into the community with the intention of finding assets and content bridges. And then if you are a community person who's seeking to understand the work of schools and to be supportive in creating a more equitable environment, talk to teachers. Get teachers to tell you what's happening in the buildings, and I think you'll probably be able to draw some great insights from there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're really speaking to the what Dr. Ginwright really focuses on in 4 Pivots is really the focus on transformational relationships. These can't be transactions. These can't be things that we're going to harvest ideas and come back and just implement them. But how are we really allowing these new relationships, these new conversations to change us at our core and to really start to change how we do everything, really. All right, so as for educators, as we're starting to think about how do we do that and thinking about co-creating these opportunities, I've had some conversations with folks that are, and it comes with one of our questions is like, I'm also an English teacher, so shout out to all 3 English teachers on this panel, right? There's something about those English teachers. But I taught high school, and so I think co-creating goals to me seems I taught 12th grade. It came very, I wouldn't say natural. It was very intentional, and it was something that I did often. But I wonder, what does that look like for a team working to co-create these opportunities and to get student voice when in a kindergarten classroom or in our ELC classrooms? Because I think about often when we're supporting educators, how do we make sure that we're providing that support for all of our learners and for all of our educators?
Yeah, I mean, I have modeled lessons in, classrooms from preschool to, adult learning. And I think that, young students are very capable of helping to come up with options. So let me give you an example of when my son was in kindergarten. This is last year, and they were doing remote kindergarten. And so, the teacher starts off and it's important that we become more comfortable with our numbers and talking about math fluency. And we're just going to do a little warm up, right? And so you all know how to log into IXL Math, which is like a fun kind of gamified way just to get like your warming up, trying to get some more math fluency. So she had taught them all how to do that. And that was like one option. And she also taught them all how to play a game called the Make 10 game, which is a warm up where I say 6. And then, okay, Brooke, how do you make 10? If I say 6, how do you make 10?
4.
Oh my gosh, we got it, right? And we can correct each other and we can work together. And those were 2 options, right? So they would put them in breakout rooms and they could play make 10, whatever. So after they got those routines down, she's like, So next week, we're going to do our math fluency warm-ups. But like, what other ways do you all like to practice counting at home? I like to sometimes, my auntie takes out a handful of Cheerios and I count as high as I can and see how many Cheerios. She's like, we should add that to the choice board. I make quizzes for myself. I like to write down and make worksheets for myself. Oh, what an amazing idea. Okay, let's do those 2 today. And then what are your other ideas? And it's so awesome, right? So like right in there, she's just typing right into the thing. And then she does like a little poll and she's like, okay, who's going to choose to count, anything, pennies, grass blades, like whatever you have available. It could be the lint off your sweater. And so I think it's that type of thing where I think that when students are older, they have more background, so there's less of that routine building. You might have to spend 3 weeks so kids learn how to like get on the iPad, get into IXL, know how to find them, because some of these students have never been in school before, right? And so I think once you build the routine of this is one way we can do it, it might not be the way that works best for you. And there's also systemic barriers, like do you have a device for every kid, right? But it was so cool to see. And this is like before they even could connect in person. And, kids just sharing kind of what they do at home. And I love that I'm seeing here as like, count the stairs as you go up and down. Like, that's a great idea to say, okay, I'm going to put on a timer for 5 minutes and here's your choices today.
Yeah, I thought last year was the hardest year to be a teacher in the history of the world, but I think it's this year. And some of it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Some of it's a function of our expectations. We've got these flawed expectations of what school was going to be like this year. I would say story. So I'm thinking a lot about story, and in the classrooms where we're having the hardest time getting students to engage, we can more often be successful when I get kids to present their emerging understanding of content in the form of story. And so story is something that I would encourage teachers to talk about, both in your presentation of your content and also in the ways in which we allow students and provide for students to show us what they're coming to know. Story, think in terms of your character, think in terms of conflict, think in terms of setting, think in terms of theme. That would be one place where I might start.
Thank you. Yeah, story is so important. I got to hear, I've been listening to All My Relations podcast, and they were talking about, just the importance of when students are sharing their stories, if we have one answer that we're looking for, we can actually invalidate their own humanity by not allowing them to share their story. And so really thinking about how are we ensuring that we're making room for their stories. We're almost done, so I'm wondering if we can ask one really quick question. And that's just really thinking about, there's quite a few questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but they have this thread of teachers unions and just really thinking about what role can teachers unions play in supporting this work? And so just a quick sort of your thoughts on that, and then we'll wrap up.
So I've done a lot of work with the WEA, the Washington Educator Association, and they have been amazingly supportive of the work of UDL. And I did put in one of the chats, like Annie Limberto, who's director over there, she's amazing. And I can tell you that at a state level, the teachers union in no way, shape, or form is pushing back on any of these frameworks. They're rightfully pushing back on, we need training, we need resources, we need connection with each other. And so I think that a lot of the pushback is not the concept of meeting the needs of all kids or evolving practice. That hasn't been my experience with teachers at all. It's like, if you're gonna expect me to do this, respect me enough to provide me with really high quality learning, time to implement and share, the opportunity to make mistakes with this, because this is an evolving piece of work that, like, if you want big returns on this, people have to take risks. And when you take risks and try something, it could bomb. And I mean that in the most loving way, that like, if I try and it doesn't work, that's just as valuable to me. I'm like, well, kids, not trying that again. Like, oops. But like, I think that we've created this very bizarre culture with Edeval where it's like, I don't want to actually set audacious goals because if I don't meet them, and it's like the whole thing is a racket. So what I would say is, I would say to teachers unions, like, what are the barriers that you're facing? Because I've never met a teacher who's like, I'm not going to teach a student with a disability. It's more, I don't know how. I don't know how to support a class if that child's being really disruptive. I feel like I need more support. And a lot of it comes down to the system needs to support teachers through these more technical measures. So, granted, you might not be able to do it right away, but I think a lot of this is just transparency and listening. Like, what do you need to do this really well? And then how do we create a plan to provide that? But again, once you talk to teachers unions, executive boards of unions, it's not, we don't want to teach all kids. It's not, we don't believe in these frameworks. It's like people are asking us to continue to do stuff, but getting blood from a damn stone. We need professional learning. We need high quality curriculum. We need family and community support, and leadership has to fight to build that.
Yeah, I'll just bring it back to the building. I would say, and I'm a pro union person, every building level union rep should be thought of as an instructional leader in that building. When we are talking about the people who are the face of the teacher union to their peer teachers in a school building, these people should be seen as having a wealth of knowledge and understanding for effective instruction, pedagogy in the local context here in our building. So one thing that I would say is I would love for the teacher unions to make it a priority that in the naming of building level reps, the building level reps are people who can hold effectively a reputation as an instructional leader in the building. I think that can go a long way toward bridging some of the gaps and kind of clarifying some of the misunderstandings that exist relative to the union at the level of the school.
Wow. Oh, this is beautiful. Just thank you so much for your time, Dr. Stembridge and Dr. Novak. And I'm going to pass it back over to Lindsay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooke. You're awesome. We love you.
Yes, I just
Right
want to
back at
say
you, Yummy.
thank you so much to everyone who came, all of your insightful questions. That conversation was better than anything I had even hoped for, and just it's kind of a little dream come true for me to have brought these two ideas together, because I just, universal design can't be done without thinking about kids' cultural assets. And if you are doing culturally responsive education, you are inherently universally designing and being inclusionary. So I'm just so, my heart is full. So thank you so much. Thank you, Brooke, for moderating. Especially thank you to Katie and Yemi. I just can't wait to see more connections in the future and how we bring this all together. I promise we will go through the chat. We will make sure you get all the resources and the connections that are in there. And then just remember that we will follow up with a survey that you need to take 4 clock hours, but please, even if you don't need clock hours, we would love for you to take it so that we can get feedback and prepare more great conversations like this one, and make them even better in the future. And I also wanted to tell you that if you are excited about these topics, we do have Camp C-Step, which is coming back in July in person for the first time in 2 years. We're so excited. We have a session on equity-focused teacher leadership, as well as creating inclusionary PLCs. So if you're interested, I'll have Erin put that in the email as well. You can find more information about that on our website. Katie and Yemi, I can't thank you enough. And OSPI, both departments, the Special Education Department and the Educator Effectiveness Office, for allowing us to do this, supporting us, and coming together to make this happen. So any final words? Otherwise, we're good. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was amazing.